The story of this aircraft started when a few F Mark II fighters were experimentally fitted with 2 underwing racks for 250-pound bombs. Naturally, this took a slight toll on aerodynamics. With the bombs attached, the airplane lost about 9 miles an hour off its top speed. With just the empty racks, it dropped by about 5 miles an hour. Still, these early successful tests became the starting point. They led to developing the most widely produced and famous version of the legendary Mosquito. This was the multi-role FB.6 fighter bomber. At the time, combat sorties by the 23rd Squadron were aggressively hunting down enemy airfields and trains. These missions revealed a critical flaw. The firepower from its 4 20mm cannons simply was not enough to guarantee the destruction of their targets. To make the aircraft more lethal, engineers proposed a new idea. They suggested mounting a pair of 500-pound bombs under the wings or using unguided rockets. The designers also pulled off a clever trick. They shrank the main fuselage fuel tank down to 60 imperial gallons. This managed to free up space in the bomb bay to perfectly fit 2 more 500-pound bombs. Understanding the unique nature of these daring raids deep behind enemy lines, the engineers decided to upgrade the test aircraft. They equipped it with powerful, uprated Merlin 25 engines. These engines cranked out an impressive 1,620 horsepower on takeoff. This was true even though they were not designed for high-altitude flying. This unique aircraft eventually became the full-fledged prototype for the FB.6 strike fighter. It made its first test flight on June 1, 1942. By October, all the main flight tests had successfully wrapped up. However, mass production had to be pushed back a bit. The engineers desperately needed time to design a completely new and significantly stronger wing. This was the so-called universal wing. It had to handle the massive structural loads from additional drop tanks, heavy bombs, and rocket launchers. The first production models of these strike fighters weighed in at a hefty 19,840 pounds on takeoff. Under the cowlings roared Merlin 21, 23, or the brand new 25 series engines. However, those early 25s were in critically short supply at first. Armed to the teeth, the airplane carried 4 250-pound bombs. It also carried a full combat load of ammo. This included 150 rounds per cannon and 500 rounds per machine gun. It also had a fuel capacity of 482 gallons. Even with this heavy payload, the aircraft had an impressive range of 1,210 miles. Its speed performance was also top-notch. Right down on the deck with those Merlin 25s, the aircraft could hit 336 miles an hour. Climbing up to 5,000 feet, it pushed 358 miles an hour. At an altitude of 13,000 feet, it topped out at 378 miles an hour. The assembly of these Mark VI models was not just handled by the main plant in Hatfield. Well-known companies like Standard Motors and Airspeed pitched in as well. In total, 2,140 units of the FB.6 rolled off the assembly lines. Stepping back from the overall timeline for a moment, it is worth mentioning another unique version of this bomber. It saw a very limited production run of just 17 airframes. The main difference between the new FB Mark 18 and its predecessors was its reinforced armor and specialized armament. This wooden Predator was built specifically for hunting German U-boats. That is why its primary weapon was a massive 57mm Moulins gun. This was backed up by 4, or on some aircraft, 2, 3, 03 Browning machine guns. On top of that, the aircraft could carry 8 underwing rockets simultaneously. To protect the crew and engines from enemy flak, they added an extra 880 pounds of armor. Because of this, the aircraft's maximum takeoff weight jumped to 21,270 pounds. The massive cannon looked so monstrous that it left quite an impression. When one of the pilots first saw it removed from the aircraft and sitting on the ground to be cleaned, he could not help but joke. He asked, "So, where are the horses supposed to pull this artillery piece?" Going back to the beginning, the idea of turning the Mosquito into a fighter bomber was born on July 11, 1941. The engineers at de Havilland initially planned to just add 4 cannons to a standard bomber. However, they eventually scrapped that straightforward approach. Instead, they decided to build a dedicated multi-role combat aircraft based on the fighter variant. They gave it a newly designed, reinforced wing. By February 1942, company leadership had completely canceled the night fighter and long-range escort projects. All their efforts were shifted entirely to a dedicated strike aircraft, the FB.6. In June, the prototype arrived at the test facility. It was heavily modified from a production B Mark IV. But exactly a month later, disaster struck. During takeoff, the aircraft suddenly lost an engine. It veered sharply. It clipped a parked Beaufighter with its landing gear strut and then slammed into another one at full speed. This unfortunate crash severely delayed the testing program. On top of that, setting up production for the new reinforced wing proved to be no easy task. As a result of all these delays, full-scale production of the FB.6 did not get underway until February 1943. Starting in August, British tactical squadrons began receiving the new fighter bombers. These formidable aircraft were distributed among several units. This included Australian and New Zealand squadrons, which were combined into the legendary 140th Wing. For over a year, from October 1943 to November 1944, these Mosquitoes were the only aircraft with the speed and audacity to carry out precision daylight bombing raids. Their targets were isolated strategic facilities, rail yards, and enemy convoys. Moreover, these multi-role aircraft made a massive contribution to the fight against Hitler's wonder weapons. They methodically wiped out launch sites and storage facilities for V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets. The combat debut of the Mosquito's strike variant came shortly after noon on October 2, 1943. 24 aircraft under the command of Group Captain Percy Pickard took to the skies to strike the Pontchâteau power station. It was located about 31 miles northwest of Nantes in France. An additional specially modified Mosquito joined the formation. This one featured an enlarged glass nose and carried film cameras to document the raid. The raid was planned flawlessly. 12 aircraft made their attack run on the deck. They dropped bombs fitted with 11-second delay fuses. The other 12 bombers suddenly popped up to 2,000 feet. Then they rolled into a steep dive right over the station. At least 6 500-pound bombs slammed directly into the heart of the target. The whole raid was so tightly synchronized. If the second group had been delayed by even a few seconds, their planes would have flown straight into the blast fragmentation from the first wave. But this time, everything went like clockwork. When the Germans scrambled their FW-190 fighters to intercept, the escorting British Typhoons easily chased them off. And even though 5 of the strike fighters and the camera ship took damage from heavy flak, every single crew made it back to England. But in combat, your luck can run out at any moment. Just 5 days later, these same fighter bombers took to the air again to strike an aircraft engine factory in the Metz area. Just like the previous mission, 24 aircraft set out. But the results of this raid were completely different. Due to heavy overcast and thick fog, the formations lost visual contact with each other. Wing Commander Wilson got separated from his flight. This left 5 planes without their flight lead, forcing them to turn back to base. Wilson stubbornly pressed on with the mission alone. He managed to find the target and carried out his attack. During the run, German anti-aircraft batteries opened up with a blistering barrage. A burst from an Oerlikon cannon tore right through the wing, and Wilson's navigator took a horrific shrapnel wound to the temple. It took a superhuman effort from the pilot to drag the battered Mosquito back home. Things were not looking any better for the other group. Their leader took a direct hit from a flak shell and went down, while another bomber simply blew up in midair for reasons that remain a mystery. Out of the other dozen aircraft on the mission, only 1 actually managed to hit the primary target, while 3 other crews dropped their bombs on a secondary target. Wing Commander Meakin was killed in a fierce dogfight, though just before going down, he managed to shoot down an enemy fighter painted in desert camouflage. Another Mosquito was shot down over Belgium, and 2 more took extremely heavy damage from flak. As if all that was not enough, on the flight back, the battered formation plowed right into a massive flock of birds at high speed. Shortly after this ill-fated mission, the legendary aircraft designer Geoffrey de Havilland Sr. visited the base. Recalling that day, he said, "Percy Pickard and I slowly walked around every single aircraft. The windshields were so plastered with feathers and smeared with bird blood that you had to wonder how the pilots ever managed to land. 4 of the planes had severely caved in leading edges on their wings, and 2 others had serious damage to their main spars." Despite these brutal losses, that same October saw the 138th Fighter Bomber Wing begin forming up. It was made up of several new squadrons, including a fierce Polish unit eager for action. They went through intense training, but the wing would not be fully ready for combat ops until February 1944. And it was during that freezing month that the Mosquito veterans from the 1st Strike Wing pulled off one of the most famous and daring operations. It was one that would go down as a legendary chapter in the history of the Royal Air Force. British intelligence received some extremely alarming news. The Germans were preparing to execute a large group of French prisoners. These prisoners had been highly active in the resistance and were being held in the notorious Amiens prison following their arrest. Local partisans had tried several times to break their comrades out, but every attempt had failed. Time was running out. That is when they came up with an incredibly risky plan. They decided to free the prisoners by breaching the prison walls and the guardhouse with precision airstrikes. To pull off this daring mission, codenamed Operation Jericho, a special strike force was assembled. It consisted of twin-engine Mosquito bombers, a dedicated photo recon aircraft to record the damage, and a dozen Typhoon fighters for top cover. Group Captain Percy Pickard took overall command of the operation. The first wave of bombers was led into combat by Wing Commander Irving Smith. The intensity of that sortie was vividly described by one of his pilots, Michael Sparks. All 18 aircraft lifted off the runway in quick succession at around 11 in the morning. We planned to hit the prison right as the German guards were gathering for lunch. But as soon as we climbed to 90 feet, we flew straight into a solid wall of weather. Snow and heavy rain were relentlessly pounding the windshield. It looked like forming up into a tight formation was going to be completely impossible. So I decided not to risk it. I just pointed the nose east toward the English Channel. Luckily, about 2 miles off the coast, the weather finally broke. Within minutes, we were flying over occupied France. We were locked into our slots in the combat formation. My bomber was in Irving Smith's 3-ship flight. Our main job was to blow a massive hole in the eastern wall of the prison. Another 3-ship was tasked with attacking the northern part of the complex. On the final and most dangerous leg of the route, we dropped right down to the deck at about 30 feet. We raced over the snow-covered Albert-Amiens highway, which led us straight to the target. I will probably never forget that road. It was as straight as an arrow. Tall poplar trees lined both sides of the route, and we literally had to hop the aircraft over them. I kept one eye glued to those trees. I kept the other on a large formation of single-engine fighters that suddenly appeared off our right nose. To our massive relief, they turned out to be our Typhoon escorts. Suddenly, the poplars ended, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. Exactly 1 mile ahead loomed the Amiens prison. Up close, it looked exactly like the scale model we had used to brief the strike before the flight. In a matter of seconds, our bombers hit the release point. We hugged the deck as low as physically possible and bled off our airspeed to a minimum. This was to ensure the heavy bombs would hit the very base of the wall. We also wanted to make sure they would not skip off the frozen ground. The second the bombs came off the racks, we pushed the throttles to the firewall. The airplanes roared right over the prison roof. Our part of the job was done. There was absolutely no time to stick around and assess the damage. We had to get out of there immediately to clear the airspace for the trailing crews. As I banked my bomber to the west, I caught sight of the second 3-ship pushing over into their attack run. They dropped their ordnance right on the northern section of the wall and soon rejoined our formation. However, Michael Sparks left out one important detail in his memoirs. Due to a severe snowstorm early in the flight, 4 strike aircraft and a few escorting fighters became completely disoriented. They were forced to abort and return to base. But even with a reduced force, the raid was highly successful. The bombs from the first flight hit right at the base of the wall, blowing a massive breach for the prisoners. A bomb from the second wave scored a direct hit on the main prison building. Right after that, a follow-up flight of Mosquitoes attacked the section of the compound housing the German guard barracks, completely leveling them. All the while, a dedicated photo recon aircraft carrying a film crew circled above the target area. It was steadily recording the results of the attack. It made 3 passes over the target at deck level. Thanks to this footage, High Command received undeniable proof of just how pinpoint accurate the Mosquito crews were. However, this triumph came at a price. On the way back, one of the bombers took a direct flak hit to the cockpit. The blast instantly killed the cameraman and severely wounded the pilot. Bleeding heavily, the pilot, Ian McRitchie, managed to crash land the battered bomber in a snow-covered field. Shortly after, he was taken prisoner by German forces. In the final stage of this risky operation, several German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters suddenly bounced the formation over the prison. The escorting British Typhoons immediately engaged them in a fierce dogfight, but they could not protect Pickard's Mosquito, which had already taken serious damage from heavy enemy flak. A well-aimed burst from a German fighter tore the tail section clean off the British bomber. The crippled aircraft plummeted, crashing near the French town of Montigny. For a while, their squadron mates from the 140th Wing held out hope that Pickard and his navigator had somehow survived the terrible crash. Unfortunately, there was no miracle. Soon after, the local resistance confirmed the crew had been killed. They also provided the exact location of their graves. The mission took a toll on the Typhoon pilots, too. One fighter was shot down near Amiens. Another vanished without a trace in a massive snowstorm over the English Channel. A third was forced to make an emergency landing. It was not until much later that the true results of the raid came to light. Out of nearly 700 inmates at the Amiens prison, 258 managed to take advantage of the chaos caused by the airstrike and successfully break free. But the price for this freedom was horrific. Over 100 French prisoners were tragically killed. Some were caught in the blasts from the British bombs, others were cut down by machine gun fire from the prison guards. On top of that, there were unintended civilian casualties just outside the prison walls, so from a purely tactical standpoint, the results were far from perfect. But the real impact lay elsewhere. As leaders of the French resistance later pointed out, this daring strike on the Amiens prison became a powerful symbol of self-sacrifice. Allied crews were risking their lives to save Frenchmen. This provided a massive boost in morale for the entire occupied population. One of the Australian navigators who flew the mission put it perfectly. He said this was the kind of operation that makes it crystal clear. Even if you did absolutely nothing else for the rest of the war, this one mission would have been more than enough. Right up until the historic D-Day landings, when massive Allied forces finally pushed onto the French coast, the combat missions flown by British fighter bombers closely resembled modern special operations. Enemy airfields were mostly left as targets for other units. Instead, bridges, industrial plants, and strategic command posts became the high-value targets for these pilots. They paid special attention to wiping out the headquarters of the SS and the infamous Gestapo. To give you an idea of their sheer operational tempo, consider these numbers. From October 1943 to May 1944 alone, aircraft of the 140th Wing flew over 1,600 combat sorties. They also launched 155 large-scale group strikes. Unfortunately, the losses were heavy too. 36 aircraft failed to return to base. Another 21 Mosquitoes had to be written off due to severe battle damage. On June 4th, ground crews started painting black and white invasion stripes on the fuselages and wings of tactical aircraft. This was done to help friendly forces identify them in the air. On the night of June 6th, the squadrons flew 113 combat sorties. They primarily targeted the enemy's supply lines and communications networks. Remarkably, despite the heavy tempo that night, only a single aircraft was lost. The following night saw even heavier action, with 196 combat sorties. Moving forward, the fighter bombers kept pushing the absolute limits of both human endurance and the airframes themselves. In just the 72 days following the Allied landings in Normandy, pilots of the 140th Wing flew 2,319 sorties. If you do the math, that averages out to 32 combat missions every single day. Consider the scale of these operations. In a single night on September 1st, 1944, British fighter bombers attacked 23 trains. These trains were pulling a combined 300 rail cars. They also destroyed over 300 enemy vehicles in transit. They sank 20 riverboats and barges across France, Belgium, and Germany. Of course, these massive successes came at a very high price. Over the course of 3 months that summer and fall, 32 aircraft failed to return from their missions. Meanwhile, another 11 took such critical damage that they were permanently grounded. Interestingly, only one specific airframe holds the title of the most successful and truly lucky aircraft in the Mosquito fighter bomber fleet. Throughout its service life, it managed to rack up a staggering 104 combat sorties. This was an exceptionally rare feat for the type. Allied command planned to relocate the fighter-bomber squadrons directly onto liberated French territory as quickly as possible. This was crucial so the tactical air forces could provide even faster and more effective close air support for the advancing ground offensive. However, the harsh realities of war disrupted those plans. The first British Mosquitoes were not able to cross the Channel and deploy to forward airfields on the continent until the dead of night on November 20th. In the fall of 1944, one of the most famous missions involving the Mosquito took place. 24 fighter bombers from the 140th Wing carried out a daring raid on the Gestapo headquarters in Jutland. That is exactly where thousands of files were kept on Danish resistance members suspected and hunted by the Germans. Just like the famous Amiens prison raid, the crews left nothing to chance. They carefully rehearsed their every move on a custom-built scale model. They dropped their ordnance in formations of 6 aircraft, flying at ultra-low level. Because they came in so low, several aircraft actually sustained shrapnel damage from their own bombs. And one Mosquito was forced to make an emergency landing in neutral Sweden. During the desperate German winter counteroffensive under General Gerhard von Rundstedt, Mosquito fighter bombers were severely limited. The main obstacle was the abysmal weather. Crews flew most of their sorties at night, when spotting small ground targets was practically impossible. Shortly after, though, the aircraft played an absolutely vital role. Their devastating strikes on rail lines and highways seriously bogged down the retreating German troops trying to shift forces to the east. On February 22, 1945, the fighter bombers joined a massive effort known as Operation Clarion. This was a heavy daytime strike against transportation networks, factories, and key hubs of German resistance. But these missions came at a steep price for the crews. There is a popular myth that by 1945, the German military was already a spent force, unable to put up a real fight. The reality was very different. In fact, between February and April of that year, Mosquito crews suffered their heaviest losses of the entire war. The vast majority of aircraft lost during this period were brought down by intense anti-aircraft fire. This was because the concentration of flak over the Third Reich remained incredibly dense. That spring became a real crucible for both Coastal Command and the dedicated Ranger squadrons. Despite the heavy toll, the war was relentlessly drawing to a close. Mosquito fighter bombers flew their final combat sorties on the night of May 4th. When the guns finally fell silent, some of these squadrons became part of the British Air Forces of occupation in Germany. Meanwhile, others relocated to bases in Belgium and the Netherlands. Interestingly enough, the legendary Mosquito FB.6 stayed in service the longest. It continued to fly with the 107th Squadron all the way until September 1949. As far back as February 1943, the RAF had started actively developing a new tactic for what they called Ranger missions. Technically speaking, a Mosquito flying a Ranger sortie was mechanically no different from a standard interceptor. The distinction came down purely to how they were employed. Interceptors usually sat on ground alert. They only scrambled when they tracked or expected Luftwaffe activity. They also relied on constant radio contact with ground controllers. Rangers, on the other hand, operated on their own initiative. They flew freelance intruder patrols. They maintained absolute radio silence to slip into enemy territory unnoticed. Their main objective was to harass and wear down the German air defense network as much as possible. The core of these forces consisted of flights of 6 Mosquitoes from each designated squadron. Meanwhile, 4 Beaufighter units contributed 3 specially equipped aircraft each. For a while, both concepts operated in tandem, perfectly complementing one another. Mosquito crews from the 264th Squadron were the first to take on the role of daylight rangers. As early as February 4th, they pulled off successful raids against enemy airfields in northern France. There was one catch, though. These risky daylight missions were only authorized when heavy cloud cover hung over most of the route and the target area. This gave the crews somewhere to hide. But for the nighttime rangers, the weather was not nearly as much of a limiting factor. For instance, on the night of February 17th, they delivered heavy strikes against enemy positions. To maximize their effectiveness, the squadron's areas of operation were strictly divided by region. Some groups hunted in the skies over southern and western France. Others covered the eastern part of the country, Belgium, and southern Germany. Meanwhile, a third group patrolled the airspace over the Netherlands and northern Germany. In the winter of 1943, a new version of the fighter-bomber appeared. It was the Mosquito FB.6. This aircraft turned out to be the perfect candidate for Ranger missions. It featured a much longer range. the ability to carry 4 bombs, and a concentrated nose battery of machine guns and 20mm cannons. This made it an incredibly effective weapon for lightning-fast, punishing strikes against the enemy. That is exactly why the 418th Squadron became the first in the Royal Air Force to get their hands on these formidable aircraft. Squadron Leader Gray left a vivid account of one of his combat sorties. He recalled, "We were heading to our first target, flying over the hills at an altitude of about 2,700 feet. Suddenly, 2 enemy fighters appeared at our 6 o'clock, slightly high. Without wasting a second, we firewalled the throttles and made a dash for the mountains. A tense 5-minute chase through a winding valley followed, after which the Germans finally broke off the pursuit. A little later, about 50 miles southwest of Munich, we spotted another pair of single-engine fighters. They were approaching from the northwest at that same altitude of 2,700 feet. My first thought was alarming. I believed these were interceptors scrambled specifically to hunt us down. However, we decided not to change course. We tore right underneath them, right on the deck. The German Bf-109s just kept flying straight, and we realized they simply had not seen us. Hoping to catch them by surprise, we banked hard and pulled up to get on their tails. But they must have spotted us after all. They suddenly pitched up hard, right into the blinding sun. Because of that, we quickly lost sight of them. After that, we got back on our original heading. Our main target was the German airfield at Erding. At almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we managed to sneak in from the southeast completely undetected. What we saw was a pilot's dream. The airfield was absolutely packed with enemy aircraft. We picked out a pair of Bf-110s parked next to each other just west of the runway. We rolled into a steep dive and attacked, raking the enemy with long bursts from our cannons and machine guns. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of dozens of rounds. They were ripping through the engines, nose, and left wing of the nearest Messerschmitt. The very next second, the aircraft exploded violently. It sent debris in all directions. I only let off the trigger when we were about 50 yards out. The second enemy fighter also caught the tail end of my burst. In the end, we claimed one Bf-110 as destroyed and the other as heavily damaged. Tearing across the airfield right on the deck, we suddenly spotted another German airplane. I immediately fired a 2-second burst. My final rounds were striking home from no more than 40 yards away. In my peripheral vision, I noticed a few hits, but I was not 100% sure the airplane was destroyed, so we only claimed it as damaged. Only then did the German anti-aircraft gunners finally come to their senses. They opened up on us with heavy flak. But it was already too late. We were going flat out and were quickly out of range. But fierce battles with the Luftwaffe were not just taking place over land. During Operation Instep, Mosquito's flying specialized ranger missions were deployed to hunt down the long-range German fighters escorting naval convoys. On July 11, 1943, over the rough waters of the Bay of Biscay, 5 British Mossies squared off against 5 German Ju-88s. In the intense dogfight that followed, 1 Junkers was sent crashing into the sea, while 3 others took heavy damage. But the skies were unforgiving. Just a day later, the Germans exacted a heavy toll. 8 FW-190s ambushed the British flight. They shot down 4 Mosquitoes in short order. Only 1 badly battered FB.6 miraculously managed to limp back to base. This bitter setback was only partially offset by a major victory from the 151st Squadron. Their pilots managed to bring down a massive 4-engine FW-200 Condor. Starting December 1, 1943, British forces launched a new wave of offensive sweeps. Groups flying intruder and ranger missions began systematically strafing and bombing enemy airfields. These daring raids became an integral part of the Allied preparations for the invasion of Europe. On January 27, 1944, British Wing Commander MacDonald, along with 2 wingmen, flew a patrol over the Bourges area in France. There, the flight hit the jackpot. The trio launched a lightning-fast attack, shredding a German HE-177 bomber. Right after that, they sent a giant FW-200 Condor crashing to the ground. And finally, they destroyed a second HE-177. Returning to base in high spirits, MacDonald quipped to 2 other pilots, Flight Lieutenants Kane and Johnson, who were just getting ready to take off. He said, "Do not even think about talking to me unless you bring back at least 4 enemy scalps." They took him at his word. Upon returning from their mission, the pilots proudly reported the confirmed destruction of 2 Ju-88s. This was along with heavy damage to 2 Ju-34s and a Ju-86. A remarkable encounter involved 2 pilots from the 418th Squadron, Flight Lieutenants Scherf and Cleveland. In February 1944, during a routine sortie, they strafed and destroyed 3 German aircraft on the ground. Considering the mission a success, the pilots had already set course for home. Then something unexpected caught their eye. Scherf's navigator, Flying Officer Finlayson, spotted a highly unusual aircraft in the distance. It was a bizarre twin fuselage German HE-111Z Zwilling. It was towing 2 heavy transport gliders. Carrying tremendous speed, Scherf overshot the target. However, Cleveland reacted instantly and managed to shoot down the trailing glider. Hauling his Mosquito into a tight turn, Scherf came in for an attack from high 6 o'clock. First, he shredded the second glider with accurate fire. Then he walked his rounds right into the central engines of the twin fuselage Heinkel. Meanwhile, Cleveland hammered the giant aircraft's right fuselage. The combined firepower was so devastating that massive chunks of debris tore off the enemy aircraft. Moments later, the rare German heavy hauler was burning on the ground. For destroying this massive target, each pilot was officially credited with 1 full kill. The squadron's logic was simple. Since the HE-111Z was practically just 2 standard HE-111 bombers mated together, it should count as 2 victories. Overall, the 418th Squadron was experiencing a true golden age at the time. To put the difference into perspective, over the previous 22 months flying Boston bombers, the pilots managed to account for 22 enemy aircraft. But the moment they transitioned to the new Mosquito fighters, their kill rates absolutely skyrocketed. In just 1 month, the pilots shot down 24 German aircraft. They lost only a single crew of their own in the process. For example, in April 1944, while patrolling over the Kattegat Strait, Flight Lieutenants Kipp and Kahn downed 4 German Ju-52 minesweepers in a single sortie. Right after that, they destroyed 3 more aircraft on the ground and seriously damaged another 2. Just a few days later, the squadron set a new record. They destroyed 10 enemy aircraft in a single day. Among them was the infamous long-nosed German FW-190D fighter. And on the night of May 3rd, Kipp single-handedly shot down 3 FW-190A fighter bombers in one engagement. These stunning successes marked a major milestone. They were the 98th, 99th, and 100th victories for the group as a whole. According to British archives, the combat record of the 418th Squadron by the end of World War II is nothing short of phenomenal. The squadron tallied 172 confirmed kills of enemy aircraft. Another 8 were listed as probable and 97 were damaged, but their targets were not limited to aircraft. The unit intercepted and destroyed 83 German V-1 flying bombs. They turned roughly 200 vehicles into scrap metal and destroyed 16 railway locomotives. Of course, the war took a heavy toll, and their own losses were painful too. 59 combat aircraft were lost in action, 92 crew members were killed, 14 pilots became prisoners of war, and another 27 remained missing in action. The top ace among the squadron's pilots was Flight Lieutenant Scherf. This is a name we have seen before. By the end of May 1944, his personal tally stood at 23.5 confirmed kills. He also set the all-time record for Mosquito fighters in a single sortie. During an incredibly intense dogfight, Scherf managed to shoot down 5 German fighters in a single engagement. In February 1944, the 100th Group received some serious reinforcements when the 515th Squadron joined their ranks. Previously, the squadron had been flying the obsolete Defiant turret fighters, but now they were completely re-equipped with the high-speed Mosquitoes. Starting in March, they were assigned a highly dangerous new mission, conducting surprise night intruder attacks on enemy airfields. At the same time, the 192nd Squadron was conducting electronic warfare missions. Some of their aircraft were specially equipped to jam enemy radar. This ensured the strike groups remained completely undetected. May became another highly successful month for the 100th Group. Its pilots flew over 200 combat sorties and successfully destroyed 18 German aircraft. Around the same time, other squadrons started receiving specially modified versions of the Mosquito. These were equipped with the secret Serrate radar detection system. This equipment was built with one single purpose: to hunt down German night fighters that were equipped with airborne radar. Thanks to the Sarret system, the British could easily home in on enemy fighters in the pitch black. However, this technological edge did not last long. By September 1944, German engineers had cracked the system and developed effective electronic countermeasures. After this, its effectiveness dropped to near zero.